which are two parallelly running pipelines carrying natural gas from Russia to Germany, were blown up. There were massive explosions which happened 250 feet below the sea. Now, the first report that came out, which was last month by a famous American journalist, which seemed to suggest that this was an inside job. It was carried out by the United States using state actors. Now, just this past week, there's been some follow-up reporting, both by the New York Times and the Washington Post, which seemed to suggest that it was not an inside job by America, but this was done by a pro-Ukrainian nationalist group, a bunch of amateurs who carried this out. What is the truth of who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? What are the consequences and the implications of that? And will we ever get to know the truth? I want to first go across to a famous American investigative journalist, a multiple-time Pulitzer winner, famous investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, whose first reporting on this last month seemed to suggest that this was done by America at the orders of the President of the United States by state actors. Seymour Hersh, thank you very much for speaking with us here on this News 18 Network Global Exclusive. So your report, which came out in February, which suggested that it was America which blew up the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines, was based on a single anonymous source, an unnamed source. Can you explain to our viewers and people who are watching this interview, who are listening to this interview on our digital platforms and on our television platforms, as to why you chose to go with a story of such huge implications, so much consequence, based on just one single anonymous source?
First of all, it didn't suggest anything. It said that the United States, working on behalf of the president and his national security advisor, it said a lot of things. And so I've been in this business for 50 years, writing about massacres, writing for the New York Times and the New Yorker magazines, eminent places, writing about CIA activities that were completely illegal, spying on Americans, overthrowing or helping to overthrow Allende in Chile, and just doing dirty work all over the world. I wrote most of those stories for the London, and also I wrote for the London Review of books too, 3 or 4 major stories. And in every 90% of them, no sources named, because I came to life over Vietnam. I was a critic of Vietnam, and I didn't grow up as I wasn't an upper class. I didn't go to Harvard or Yale. I wasn't editor of the paper. I grew up in an immigrant family in Chicago, and worked my way through school, and a very good university, and I started my career as a police reporter in Chicago, which is really a tough place to be, and later got to work with the Associated Press. And in '65, I was assigned to cover the Pentagon, the Defense Department. And OJT, on the job, I learned how awful Vietnam was and how much murder was going on. And I wrote about that. And I eventually got shoved out because of what I was writing. And I ended up writing in '69 a story about a massacre of 500 innocents in Vietnam called the My Lai massacre. That was an enormous story, which wasn't believed when I first wrote it, was not believed. So I have, in my career, I've written many stories with anonymous sources that weren't believed. When I worked for the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine, that wasn't an issue because they would check and know, and they understood who I was dealing with. I'm now working, because everything has changed in my media because of Trump. You're either for Trump or against Trump, and the newspapers have continued that. Either they're for the Democrats or not for the Democrats, and there's a big division. And it's not like it used to be. It wasn't as objective as it was when I first started. And we're talking about somebody who started in the '60s. And so I know people. And the one thing, I've written a lot of stories in my life. I've won, 50 prizes, and Pulitzer Prize, 5 Booker, all sorts of prizes. And the one thing I've never done is written a story to put anybody in trouble. And the other thing we should know, that the people that come to me, and sometimes they come to me, and there are people who respond to me. They are the people in the intelligence community, in the military, in the government, in the State Department, who, when they take the oath of office, as we do in America, it's not to their immediate boss, it's not to the Secretary of State, it's not to the general, it's to the Constitution. And those are the people I deal with, and those are the people I protect. So in that story, which I wrote for something called Substack, it says, well, you publish your own. I use editors I worked with at the London Review and a fact checker I worked with at the New Yorker. Same standards, my own, but this time I don't have to worry about editors. I think if 90% of the editors in America disappeared tomorrow, it'd be much better for the press. So I'm just saying all that because I'm not coming from outer space on this story. I understood it was going to be important. And so last fall, the pipelines were blown up September the 26th last year. Yeah. And there was no way, common sense, you have to deal with common sense. Well, let's see. Russia, Putin, before the war, in response to our language, and if you follow what's going on in communist China now, or China, the government there is responding quite to the language of Washington. The language of Washington has become, under Biden, with his Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor Sullivan, and the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria. They're all very hostile to both Beijing and Moscow, just very hostile. And it's inappropriate, I think, in a way. I mean, I'm entitled to have my thoughts. So anyway, I knew that no way Russia had, don't mind my phone, it rings even now. I knew that no way Russia would have done it because Putin already had responded. There's two major pipelines, Nord Stream 1, which has been alive since 2011, and Nord Stream 2, these are huge. They move millions of whatever the measurement is of natural gas. There is a different measurement, and it's not cubic feet. It's they move in. Nord Stream 1 turned Germany because it supplied cheap natural gas that was very clean, more than they needed it. Anyway, I'm just giving you all this because I'm not. I can answer your question, but I'd be coming from the blue, and I don't want to come from the blue. I want people to understand I've done this a long time. Sure, and I've never put anybody in the dock.
So the White House, Mr. Hersh, they have rejected your story outright. They've called it a figment of your imagination. More fiction than fact is the wording that they used. Germany has also taken a very cautious line on your story. You referred before in your first answer to Western media like the New York Times, the Washington Post. Had you taken your story to the editors there, would they have published such a consequential story basis just one single unnamed anonymous source? How would you react to that?
The way you described the story and the intent of how I sourced it was to be as vague as possible. It would have been very dangerous to have somebody. It would be dangerous for anybody telling me this story to be in a meeting. Because the one thing my government can do well is find people. And I think it's very important when I say I've never burned anybody. So I'll take the heat on the question of sources. What I said was somebody who had access to information, and that could be 1 million people. And so the story simply is, I asked the question last fall in October. The pipeline was blown up in September. Common sense said that since Putin himself had ordered the first pipeline to be shut down in anger at the language of the Biden White House, this is before there was any talk of an invasion of Ukraine. The language from the beginning was very rough, and as it was towards China, and unnecessarily so. I thought. I mean, I have a right to an opinion as an American citizen, And so I asked the question, and then I got into the story, and here's what happened in a nutshell in my story. I can tell it to you in 2 minutes.
Sure.
Joe Biden, for reasons I think, one thing, I've been around long enough, and I've written an awful lot of books on foreign policy and a lot of tough issues, and 11 books, I think, along with being a reporter. And the one thing that's common is the idea that presidents do well politically in wars. When they're in warriors, they get support from the American people. That's just the way it is. It's a natural thing. And Biden has been in public life since he was in the Senate since 1972. Yeah. He knows how to do it. The staffs, all people who pushed for in the 70s and 80s, pushed for the growth of NATO, encroaching to the east, which is something that Putin has drawn a line. So do not bring NATO on my border, and do not bring missiles on my border, which we also did. We put what we call defensive missiles in Poland, 800 miles. What's that? 5 minutes by satellite, by a rocket, to take out all of it. We just were escalating. So he shut down Nord Stream 1, which was the main supply of gas to Germany. And the whole question of German natural resources is a big one for America as part of our notion of containment, the World War II notion. We have to contain communism. All that happened is from the Kennedy era. The concern was Russia was always selling a lot of its available gas and oil. It has tons of it. It's a huge country, 13 time zones, all kinds of gas and oil, great reserves. They were selling it to Germany very early, and also to Western Europe. Western Europe, which was redone after World War II. And don't forget, the Germans had spent, a decade in World War II, maiming, bombing, and raping all of Western Europe. They were hated. But they also had a great supply of cheap national gas. They were rebuilding, and they were Willy Brandt. It was called Ostpolitik. The idea was, we are going to be good neighbors to you in Western Europe. The French are going to end up liking us and dealing with us. That's not quite right, but they still get along. And so we always worried about the Russian influence on our Western Europe. The Western Europe we helped build after World War II. We made a democracy. So that's all there. It's been a historical hostility to the idea that Russia could have a direct line in by supplying gas. So the war is on. Biden wants a lot of support. He's pushing NATO right now. I will tell you right now, even though things are going very bad, I think, for the Ukrainians, why anybody would think Russia's going to lose a war in Stalingrad, which most of you, I assume you still, I'm sure that you studied that war, don't you? World War II.
Yeah.
Well, in Stalingrad, the famous battle, Russia was losing 2,400 dead and wounded every 4 hours, and they won. And they're not going to lose. It's up to, he can do it as fast or as slow as he wants. Last fall, Biden got a briefing, the best I can tell, and the bombing took place in September. He had authorized this mission to give him a capability. What he wanted to do was get a capability to blow up the pipelines to keep Germany from falling away. As long as the second pipeline was controlled by Chancellor Scholz, who just came to Washington this week and had a nice, he was patted on the head like a little puppy dog and sent back. Scholz came and had a little meeting, no press conference, no reporter got to see him much. It was just the craziest thing I've ever seen. I don't know how Scholz is going to stay in office if he keeps on behaving that way, like a lapdog. But the Chancellor of Germany, the second pipeline was brand new. It's the first one I said started in 2011. The second one was built because there was a need for gas. Germany was retailing. They were selling it downstream. They were selling Russian gas. They had so much at such a cheap price. They were selling to distributors in Western Europe and making a profit. And Russia looked away. It's okay. So the second pipeline, called Nord Stream 2, was completed in about late 2020 or late 2020, when things were already tense, when Russia clearly Putin had said, I've had it. He's already considered the Ukrainians to be a sub-level, serfs. There's a famous famine in 1932 when Stalin was in control. There was a famine, and Stalin took all of the grain from the Ukraine, and 22 million Ukrainians starved because the grain was taken to Russia. I mean, that's just the way Russia's treated them. And the fact that we were going to expand NATO right to the border of Ukraine was very tough. There was a lot of warnings that Putin was going to do something about it, whether rationally or not. So I'll finish my soliloquy. And so Biden, in the late fall, despite what the press were talking about, the American press, about how well the Ukrainians was doing, was looking at a real problem. And the Germans and some West Europeans were worried about an open commitment to Biden's war. They didn't buy it. And so the issue for Biden then was, how can I prevent maybe the winter would be, September, winter's coming. The pipeline was closed. It was full of gas, but Scholz himself had stopped it. He'd sanctioned it. Suppose Scholz decides, I'm not going to give him another 300 billion. The Americans have spent so far $113 billion on that war, just down the. And so Biden's worry, the only reason I can explain for blowing up the pipelines, that he had a team study the issue. I wrote about this in the articles I wrote for the Substack group for them in 4 weeks. He had a team there very early, before the war began. He wanted an option. He asked the CIA, give me an option. What can I do to convince Putin not to go to war? And one of the options was, and this team went to Norway, which has been an ally of us in Vietnam, and Norwegians have been our helpers on down and dirty stuff all the time. And so they went to Norway, where they set up. The Norwegians are wonderful seamen, and they wanted to do this. The pipeline runs 750 miles all the way down the Baltic Sea, directly from Russia to Germany. And so the goal was, give me an option to blow it up. And they did. And the war started, despite the fact Putin warned Russia about this. He put in February, 2 weeks before Russia invaded, he said, I can blow up your pipeline, which I must say didn't make the people doing this secret work happy. They were not supposed to be talking about it, but nothing happened. They did put mines in place. Very difficult to do. It's a big pipeline, steel pipeline covered by a concrete cover that's as high as a man, 6 feet high. To protect the pipeline from the salinity or the salt and water in the Baltic Sea. Anyway, so they did the job, but once the war began, the people in the community didn't think he would do it. There was no reason anymore to do it. In September, he gets a briefing. And the best I can tell, why September the 26th? I don't have a good picture, but I know for the first time, the intelligence was saying it's going to be a long war. He decided then to do it. And he had set it up so he could just say yes, and a day later it would blow up. There's a way of setting mines. They work by sonars, low frequency. You can blow them up. You can do it. It's a tough thing to do. And so why? At that point, what he was deciding is, this is going to be a long war. It's going to cost a lot of money. I'm going to go all the way. He's now moving a lot of American troops and equipment into Poland. I don't know if he's going to commit NATO to it. I don't know if NATO wants to go. But he basically gave Chancellor Scholz, took away the option of Scholz to say, I'm going to stop giving him arms. Winter's coming. I want that pipeline. I want to keep my people warm and wealthy. So he blew it up. He committed, I don't know if it's an act of war. People call it that. He told the Germans, and this is a big issue in Germany. He told the Germans, I'd rather have my war than, even though the United States has had West Europe, there's no oil and gas in Western Europe. He said, I'd rather have my war, and I don't care what happens to you next winter, whether it's going to be cold or not. And it wasn't such a bad winter, but prices have gone sky high anyway. People most of the energy is done by gas turbines. This summer, if it's hot, what are they going to do for air conditioning? In the winter, what are they going to do if they don't have any more reserves? There's he's just taken away a major way for Germany and Western Europe to be profitable and warm and happy.
Now, Mr. Hersh, just yesterday we had the New York Times put out a story, and then a follow-up was done by the Washington Post. Both of those stories seem to suggest that the Nord Stream pipelines were actually blown up by a bunch of Ukrainian nationalists. They had no connections to either America or to the White House, the Biden administration, or even, for that matter, to the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. So in a sense, the story by the New York Times and the follow-up by the Washington Post, it kind of contradicts your story, which said that it was American state actors who carried out this attack. Those two reports suggesting it was Ukrainian nationalists, perhaps a bunch of amateurs, who carried out this attack. How do you respond to this seeming contradiction? Because both of it cannot be true.
Well, you could imagine it certainly contradicts my story. I'm amused that it was unnamed sources, because that was the basis for not attacking. Like you began your story with unnamed sources. How can you have it? It's mean. That's why I wanted to do my little speech, because it's not something. I spent 3 months doing this, and you can how I source it is as minimal as possible. I'm not suggesting anything more than that. I'm just very careful about it, and I don't want to talk about it. I was asked that question by maybe 50 times yesterday by the press. This has been a big issue. And what I've said to everybody is, well, if you want to know the truth, I always thought the real outside person, the country that did it, would have been Somalia. That's what I said. And you can take that for what it is.
What does that mean?
How crazy is it for you guys at your desperation? Can I tell you something? The president of the United States has an enormous power. And one of his power is, and the word of art is called tasking. He can task the American intelligence community. We're all over the place. We have the National Security Agency. We have that monitors communications. We have we're in 800 different countries. This crazy America of mine, with the notion that somehow we're the best. We're the perfect ones, and which I disagree with. I don't know why we think we have to have troops everywhere. We also have a big detachment in Somalia. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? He never tasked the American intelligence community, and don't ask me how I know it, but I know it. I've lived it with secrets in my life. I'm very good at that. That's been my whole life, of breaking stories nobody else has. A long pattern of that. I worked for the New York Times for 7 or 8 years. It started jumping in my head when I ran stories. I did one story about the CIA spying on American citizens, which is aptly forbidden to do under the charter that when it was set up in 1947. You cannot spy on America. They spied on thousands, hundreds of thousands of anti-war kids from Lyndon Johnson, and reporters. Became a big issue. There was a big congressional committee about it. So obviously I've been there again. And the only thing I can say is it's a story that's so crazy that I had to deal with just a group of Ukrainians. Do you know what it takes to use C4 to blow up a pipeline that's covered by a concrete shield? You know the much of power you have, the skill you have to have. The team that was involved that started working in Norway with the CIA and other agencies, they practiced for months, and they got the best divers they could get from a very superior training center in Florida. It's a weird place to be. I started my story with that place. It's way out of the way, but they trained the best divers. And you know what divers do in America? They do good things. If there's a harbor that's blocked, they can go down and blow it up. They know how to use plastiques. And blowing up something is easy. Blowing it up correctly and safely is hard. You have to practice that. They do bad things. They blow up pipelines of people, they blow up not pipelines, but underwater rigs for underwater oil and gas. We've attacked other people's works. That's what we do for a living. We're tough guys. And so the idea that you can train some guys from Ukraine to go do this 260 feet below the surface, where to go down, the diver has to stop every 90 feet because otherwise you get bends. And then you have these 4 large pipelines. To know what you're doing is so hard. And so whoever thought up that story in the White House or wherever it is, my problem with the people that are in the national security business, Blinken, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, the guy that wouldn't go to China, meet his counterpart because of a balloon, they're so hostile. And Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and Newland, I call them Winken, Blinken, and Newland for the children's story. They're way over their head. They're just not, they may have great degrees from the best universities, but they're just not very smart when it comes to common sense. The president of the United States could have asked the CIA, the NSA, something called the Major Office for Intelligence. It's called the ONI, Office of National Intelligence, which is the top dog, and they have an office for intelligence. He could have tasked them all to tell me who did it, because we have such access. We can go back and copy conversations, pull up conversations that took place 2 years ago and replay them. That's how much security we have. We copy everything. Mm-hmm. But he never did it. You know why he didn't do it? Because he knew the answer. Of course he did it. And he can write all these stories. The Washington Post did one too, but the same idea. The Zeit also had a stranger one about some guys in a pleasure boat doing it. And there was blood on the boat, and they found traces of explosive. C4 is not an explosive. C4, the kind of spice, it's a very volatile. I mean, you can trigger it, But C4, the amount they used was enough to blow up a major building in New York for the pipelines, because they had to blow up the cover and the pipeline and also survive. I'm telling you, the problem with the story is, for them, they never acknowledged my story. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the White House. The White House denied it. And the cable companies, Trump changed America. Trump, you were either for Fox News or you were for CNN and MSNBC. And that's the way it was divided. And so I come down with this story, and I'm not Trump, but it's a story not friendly for Biden, because the implications for Europe are horrific. And I will tell you, this story has not stopped cooking in Europe. That's what kept it alive when the American press never wrote about my story at all. I got an awful lot of attention, I'll tell you that. The price of electricity in France is up 500%. In Italy, the natural gas is 3.5 times, 350% more. And France, it's just had an increase in the kilowatts. Most of their energy, the gas is used to drive turbines that create electricity. And it's already going up. And Germany has, of course, because they're so frugal, they've been subsidizing people since this winter was a mild winter. They were subsidizing. There's not enough gas. The largest chemical company in the world, BASF in Germany, 100,000 employees, has been talking to China about moving some of its facilities there. It's just talks, but they have trips there because they had to have a shutdown for the first time. Bakers that have 12 ovens heated by gas have only running 4 because they've done enough gas, and the gas is expensive. And and then the idea that the president of the United States took their gas away because he was worried that they wouldn't put enough money into a war he's not going to win. And God knows what's going to happen when it gets clearer that he's not going to win. What's going to happen? And that's why this story has traction, because my country is really about this White House.
As per your reporting, there were multiple players involved in this top secret operation. You had the president's office, you had the National Security Advisor's office, the Secretary of State's office, and of course, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. All of them were involved from the American side. You also say in your report that the Norwegians were directly involved. So it was not just the Americans, the Norwegians were directly involved. You also say in your reporting that the Swedes and the Danes had also been briefed about it. It happened off an island that is close to both Denmark and Sweden, controlled by Denmark, of course. And yet, for 6 months after this explosion happened back in September, and your story came out in February, how come this story did not leak? How come no one had wind of this story? How do you explain how they managed to bury such a story of such huge consequence, which had such multiple players, multinational players, from ever coming out?
Well, first of all, there weren't so many players. There were 2 miners, 2 divers. The people could go down. It was in the military chain of command. If it was in the special forces, the SEALs or the CIA alone, they'd have to tell Congress. But it was constructed as basically a military operation in which had a CIA component. It was always, and so the divers were not SEALs, who are special operators, and only 2 divers were used. That's how skilled they were. These are people that had spent 20 years doing it, and they're tough. They don't talk. The divers always, the Navy divers that are good, always joke about the American Navy SEALs. The commandos, they're heroes. They say they're like swimmers, and they talk too much. They go on television and they write movies. They're always in movies about some SEAL doing that. You won't cite a movie about a Navy diver. And so they're very good. They keep their mouth shut. How many people have to know? You have to deal with the Norwegians. And a week after I did this story, I did something called Substack. I publish when I want. I publish every Wednesday, a piece once a week, and you get an audience that way. And the people have to pay, and it's a different thing. And the Norwegians have always been our boys. They were in Vietnam long before the war. The North Vietnamese went in. We were doing operations with Norwegians driving our SEALs off the coast of Norway. The American SEALs would go in at night and try to blow up radar installations, cause trouble domestically, with food props and stuff like that. Long before the war was declared, We wanted Johnson wanted North Vietnam to do something aggressive. The war was going on in the South and it wasn't going well in 1964. He wanted to take the war to the North and start bombing. And they finally had invented, and it's a famous story, they invented a North Vietnamese attack on an American destroyer that didn't take place. And they lied about it. And Johnson went on television. He said, I'm going to respond. And America said, yes, yes. You know, we're all very jingoistic. We're all jingoistic at heart. You know, if somebody kicks me, we want to kick back. And the war started on a false premise. The Norwegians were all over that. I have photographs of Bill Colby, the head of the CIA, who I tangled with a lot in the 70s, working for the OSS, the American Office of Strategic Services, you know, the underground people that worked against the Germans. But what the White House has done is just made us stumble in their panic. If they want to find out what happened, just ask their CIA or officially ask. It's called a task. You send a tasking order. That means that the president, everybody jumps up, aye, aye, sir. But they haven't done that. Why haven't they done that? Do you really think Putin, who shut down one pipeline, is going to blow up with the other one? I mean, who thought that? Nobody. And so who else could have done it? That's why I was, you know, I can't think of who. I can't, you know, Pakistan, right. You know. So keep on going. What else? I know I should be more serious about something like this, but I've been there and done it. When I wrote the My Lai story about the massacre, more than half the country thought I should be, you know, hung up to dry because how could I be a traitor? You know, I'm exaggerating slightly. They didn't believe the story. And I've done that before. I don't do what I do lightly. And once I learned, I knew how to get the story because I've been around, long of tooth.
All right, Mr. Seymour Hersh, thank you very much for your time and for your insights. We leave it to our viewers to decide what the truth is on who brought about these explosions and how it exactly happened and what was the consequence of it. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on the News 18 network.
I'm glad to spread the word.